closely with people's movements and political organizations across the global South, that I got to understand a little bit more about the missing pieces, and I hope I can share some valuable experiences from the global South with you today. And this experience really is through the work of my institute, which is the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. So I'm going to share some slides if that's fine. Let me just do that. I hope you can see them. Is the slide okay? Yes. Great. So I think some of the questions I was thinking about is, of course, in the global South, and you are based in India, you'll know very well. There's many questions that are facing us in terms of why is it that we have, 1 billion people who live in so-called informal settlements, and why can, examples of well-funded participatory projects seem to improve a little bit of a neighborhood, but doesn't really address some of the underlying systems that produced the crisis in the first place. And of course, thinking about the traditions of who produces the city, like Lefebvre and others, the questions of in whose interests and how could we actually produce cities in a different way, not just about inclusivity, but what does that fundamental social and economic transformation would be required? Certainly, it's not just a question about good governance or right to the city. If it's not about questions of land, for example, questions of rural reform, urban reform, land reform, questions of political power as well. And I want to share some of the experiences that question those things and actually are, I think, quite inspirational for many of us across the global South. So, of course, I said at Lefebvre, we know very well, and back in the 70s was talking about social space being a social product. And so if space is produced, then it can be produced differently. And today, the 4 experiences I'm going to share with you quickly, briefly, are places that I have had a chance to get to know. I live in China. I used to live in South Africa, and I also lived in Brazil. I visited Venezuela. So I'm happy to be sharing some of these experiences that I've had a chance to see firsthand and had the privilege, and also to meet a lot of the people who live in these communities, have worked in the communal kitchens, or are political organizers of these movements that produce these spaces. And so here are the 4 examples that I'm going to go briefly into, from South Africa, Brazil, Venezuela, and then China. Of course, I don't have that much time, so I hope this is just an introduction to some experiences you may or may not already know, to help inspire the discussions you're having during the course. So in Durban in South Africa, 2 years after the end of apartheid, today, the white population still owns roughly 72% of all the registered farmland. And this is according to a 2017 state audit. And the full picture, including corporate trust holdings, remains deliberately opaque. So it means that even though there was a political transformation, there was no fundamental economic and land transformation, though it was part of the sort of revolutionary demands that came out of what's called the Freedom Charter. Today, there are 3 to 4 million people who live in shack settlements. And so what we've seen, and there's often called the townships, as they're locally called. And one of the organizations that have emerged to really deal with the question of shack settlements is an organization called Abahlali Bazamujondolo, or Residents of the Shack, or Shack Dwellers, which was born in 2005, after the ruling party, the African National Congress, sold a piece of land in Kennedy Road in this province, that had been promised to residents for housing. And this organization organized this road blockade that resulted in arrests, of course, a mass movement, popular movement that came together. And what has, in the last 20 years, they just celebrated the 20 years last year, this organization of shack dwellers have now organized 180,000 members and over 100 branches across 5 provinces, specifically on the question of right to housing, but with also a broader horizon. And I want to say that for the work that they've done, they've also faced a lot of persecution. 24 members of this movement have actually been killed and assassinated, a lot to do with their political work that they've been doing. And so one of the communities that they built is called Ikanana. They call the Ikanana commune, which is on the occupied land in Cato Manor. And it's probably one of their most advanced sort of urban self-governance examples that they've been able to build, where 109 families on 2 hectares are living. And they've decided more recently to begin to look at food production as well, 1 hectare dedicated to farming, and where they have actually had a lot of exchange with international organizations like the MST, the Landless Rural Workers Movement in Brazil, one of the largest social movements in the world. And there they have a poultry farm, communal kitchen. They've been installing solar panels to guarantee electricity in a very precarious area. In there also, as you can see in the picture on the left, they also have developed a political education school named after Frantz Fanon, the well-known Martinican psychiatrist and Marxist. And one of the things is this commune has 4 commitments. The first is looking at the decommodification of land. So you're not allowed to buy or sell or no renting of plots that have been occupied, of course. They practice a democratic governance, mostly through assemblies. You saw some of the pictures I had shown you. A commitment to confront gender-based violence, and an equal participation in what they called militant work. Militant work would be the physical labor that is required to maintain such a space and community. And I think this is the national leader, Spu Sekode, and this is a quote from him, and he says, I often talk about the African idea of Ubuntu. And when I do, it's not just referring to the concept, but it's a praxis that demonstrates, builds, and defends collective humanity. And it's a broad political spirit of humanism. And for them, that humanism is socialism, particularly a democratic socialism built from below. And I think it's an important thing. I think these kinds of organizations often also struggle around, the kind of NGO language around stakeholder engagement or community-driven development. But for them, it's very clear that their struggle for housing is linked to class struggle, is linked to communities' right to self-determination, and it's linked to the project or the vision of socialism. And then I'm next going to go into a second example, from the commune experience to, I already alluded to the movement in Brazil called the Landless Rural Workers Movement, or MST in short. One of the things I think is that what the MST has been able to do is actually bring, let's say, the spirit of this commune into a mass movement with the organizational depth, the territorial reach, and then also a strategic vision around a broader project of social transformation. It's not enough just to win land, let's say, for landless workers. It's important to also have a project around social transformation. So in Brazil, I'm not going to talk broadly about MST, but I think it's very interesting. As a peasant organization and mass movement with over 2 million members, they have now in recent years also turned towards the urban. And I want to share a little bit about their main urban strategy. In Brazil, one of the most land-rich countries in the world, we have, 76% of the arable land is actually in the hands of agribusiness that produce soy, beef, sugar, basically for the world commodities market. Just 7 transnational corporations dominate the entire agricultural economy. And given all this production we had during the middle of COVID, and also the Bolsonaro far-right government, 33 million Brazilians fell back into poverty under President Lula. He had taken Brazil out of the hunger map. And so during this period, MSC also begins to look at this question, and what is their relation between the countryside and the city? As I said, there's about 2 million members across 24 of Brazil's 26 states. They have, through a practice of occupying basically land that does not fulfill its social function, that's not producing, under the Constitution, after the dictatorship, there's a right to basically for the state to expropriate that land at a certain cost and distribute those lands for agrarian reform or for land reform to families that have occupied. And through this process, 450,000 families have been settled into redistributed lands, about 2 million people in total, and they're organized across, for example, hundreds of cooperatives and other alternative forms of family scale farming. And so what happened is during the Bolsonaro government, when the pandemic hit, we saw a huge crisis in Brazil, which claimed the lives actually of around 800,000 Brazilians, which is really a huge crime given that Brazil has as the largest public health system and had the capacities to confront this health pandemic in a different way. And so to respond to the fact of this pandemic moment, MST decided that, the peasants and in their territories, that the settlements they're called, had an economic base and were able to kind of shield themselves a little bit from the big impacts, especially on food and hunger, and that they needed to do something around the urban. And so many of these cooperative farms, they mobilize their food production on a short notice. The transport networks basically connect their production from the settlements in the rural areas to the city. They mobilize their cadre of very experienced organizers to be able to develop a network of distribution of food. And in this, in the last 4 years or so, they created this program called Mãos Solidarias, or Solidarity Hands. And just in one city alone, has delivered over 1.6 million meals, and that multiplies by quite a lot across the country. And how they organized it is to really understand that the countryside and the urban areas is not a separate thing. And so how they use the methodology they use is to organize amongst the families in the settlements and in the encampments. Every families are organized into what they're called as base groups, usually 6 to 7 families, and that is your kind of unit. It could be considered like a branch, and then they are aggregated across different levels. And so they reproduce that same method in the urban areas to organize families around this. They also developed a very vast network of community residents as volunteers to work and get trained also by the movement and in basic healthcare, education, and developing this solidarity economy. And one of the important things is this is not a project of, let's just say, charity. It was a project of how to turn those residents who are volunteering also into organizers in this Mãos Solidaria, or Solidarity Hands project. They would organize different kinds of things, such as primarily the community kitchens that are not just places to eat or receive a meal, which is absolutely necessary, but it's a place to also talk about political education, talk about who owns the land, talk about questions of poverty, talk about questions of hunger, talk about the questions of the urban-rural divide. And in that space, they also learned a lot from the Cuban experience, specifically the Sim Eu Posso, or Yes, I Can, literacy campaign. So this was also done alongside the food distribution and the food canteens that they organized across urban centers in the country. One of the things, of course, Brazil is home to Paulo Freire, the well-known Marxist popular educator, and they really apply this in the way that they do their work, even when it comes to solidarity work, such as delivering food. And João Pedro Stedley is one of the national leaders, and I think it's an important thing that, what he says, and I quote here, that agrarian reform is the most important urban policy. And that is putting the rural countryside agenda also intimately connected to the urban question, because it's not only a question of the countryside feeding the city, but it's much more broader connection, especially when we talk about migration, rural-urban migration, and now also urban to rural migration and the very interconnected economies. And so one of the things I think in recognition of the success of this movement-led uh, 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 solidarity initiative is that the Lula government in 2023, when he came back into power, he named a national plan for solidarity kitchens. So this is from the government now, which was directly modeled on the MST's program. And I think it's really important because we don't want movements to replace the role of states in the sense of being able to provide the basic necessities such as food, including other questions of housing. And so in this sense, the kind of movement model became adopted as an institutional architecture, and many of the kind of people falling back into hunger have now recuperated in the years since. And so in the sense, the food sovereignty of the urban residents is definitely not a rural issue, but is a national issue that connects the countryside with the city. The next example I wanted to go into now is really now a level of the states building towards socialism. And of course, in this current moment that we're seeing the U.S. assaults against Venezuela, it's important to also highlight what Venezuela has been trying to build in the last 7 years since the Bolivarian Revolution. And one of the main things is their innovation and the creation of the commune as a political form, as an urban form, and an urban form on the scale of a country the size of Venezuela. In particular, I wanted to talk about one specific tradition of this commune, but in one example of one commune, which is called the El Panal in Caracas. So in 2006, actually 3 years before Hugo Chavez began promoting the communal model nationally, there was a collective called Alexis Vivi that declared their neighborhood as a commune. And they themselves were inspired by Marx's writing on the Paris Commune in 1871. And one of the residents and the leaders in that process said that Marx said the communards created an almost perfect democracy. That is why the first proletarian revolution became a model for us. So they saw themselves as part of that tradition, of course, with their own realities and conditions. So today, El Panal, which is the word for a beehive in Spanish, is a community of 13,000 residents, and they collectively control a textile factory that produce almost 2 million garments a year. There's fish farms, there's recreational facilities, of course, for the community. There's also an urban pig farm. Beyond just producing sort of the raw materials, they also have production capacity, which is a sugar packaging plant. So there's processing, as well as urban gardens that and of 36 hectares of agricultural land. They've also experimented and built a communal bank with its own local currency backed by its agricultural production. And similar to the MST example, they have a canteen that feeds nearly 200 people over several years at a time. And their main organic governance model is through direct democratic assemblies. A picture in the background here you can see. They call it the permanent communal assembly, or the queen bee, because if you're a beehive, it's you're the collectively formed the queen bee. Here are some more pictures, including the local currency that they have at the commune. I mentioned the textile workshop, which I think is important to note, is that they have industrial size scale sewing machines and is able to produce and a model also where it can generate income for its own community, as well as wages and a kind of economic base for the community. And I think one of the important things is in this process, very similar to the MSC process, is that in this, just meeting the material needs of the people is not enough. There must be also a political project of transforming the consciousness of the people. And one of the residents and leaders were talking about if the consciousness is not transformed, then we'll never manage to build socialism. And so the commune is not just, building this community and seizing these means of production. It's also about this broader project of building socialism under the Bolivarian Revolution. Here's the leader I was talking about, Robert Longa. Um, and I think one of the things now, unfortunately, we won't be able to talk much about the Venezuela under the current sanctions regime, as well as, the kidnapping of the President Maduro, as well as Celia Flores that we saw at the beginning of this year, is that the blockade has also really tried to design to destroy the Bolivarian Revolution and many of its socialist experiments. As sanctions tighten and the economy collapse, especially around the 2017, there was also a kind of reactivation of the community in order to sustain um, what those blockade actually did. And he was saying that we had nothing to eat, we had nothing to wear. So that's the time we had to hunt, fish, and gather. We're at year zero. And in a way, what they were able to do to build that capacity to produce their own food, their own textiles, and their own economies helped them sustain the kind of imperialist aggressions against their country on a national level. And one of the things is that uh, that the idea of needing to subsist, this mere subsistence, had to be turned into a form of resistance. And that resistance then opened a path towards emancipation. It's not enough just to survive or just to meet the most basic goods, but you want a project of broader human emancipation. So in around the country, there are 49,000 communal councils. So I'm giving you just one example of how these councils are run. They're spread across 3,600 similar kinds of communes. And it's in these process, through these councils, through these communes that form the basis of the democratic structure in Venezuela. For example, in 2024, as part of a massive participatory budgeting process, all of these communes and communal councils were mobilized so that they could have 6.5 million voters participate in that national participatory budget process, which is an incredible scale. So this is not just a sort of neighborhood level project. It's about building an architecture for our new state while experimenting on these different forms, while at the same time confronting basically the siege from the U.S. aggressions that are exactly against this model of development. And the final example, and I hope I'm not going over too much over time, is around the example I'm based in Beijing, but right now I'm in Shanghai, and I want to share a little bit about what we've been seeing in China in the recent years. Especially, again, another example of a socialist state that retains the commanding heights in the economy and can actually help direct them towards several questions, urban question. One of the things I think it's important to understand, of course, China is a very big question, a big topic. We could spend a lot of time talking about it together, but here in China, all urban land is owned by the state. And that's something that, of course, came out of the revolutionary process, the land reform process, and it's protected under the Constitution. And the reforms that we saw from the early socialist period, even throughout to the Deng Xiaoping period of the opening up reform, means that in the last 50 years, 850 million people in China have been lifted out of extreme poverty, which meant that in 2020, China officially declared the end of the eradication of extreme poverty of a country the size of India. Now, India, of course, has a bigger population than China. And of course, the question of land has been central to this whole process. So in recent years, Shanghai became the first city in China to adopt what's called the 15-minute community life circle, which is to ensure that every resident is able to walk to a health clinic, a school, an elderly care center, a child care facility, a wet market or a market that sells fresh food and meats and everything like that, a park, and everything within 15 minutes of walking, and became one of the first pilots. In China, of course, the policy is often done through pilot areas, pilot zones, testing, correcting, improving, and then trying to apply to other places. So by 2024, so 2 years ago, in the country now, 4,300 of these life circles have been built. Sorry, in Shanghai, serving or across the country, serving over 100 million people. And the idea is that within the next few years, by 2030, there'll be 10,000 of these living circles across 100 pilot cities. And one of the things I think is really important and quite distinct, let's say, from other experiences that have, say in Europe that have implemented similar things, is the question of land I'll go into in a second. But it's also that when the national government makes such targets, it becomes a binding obligation for the municipalities or the pilot zones. And that's a very important thing on how China deals with its urban planning or broader state planning. And because the state owned this land, urban land, and it sells the right of use, it means that when such decisions are made, it actually is responsible for allocating such land to develop, for example, these 15-minute living circles. And so we have to understand that it operates very differently than the capitalist property relations in terms of how urban planning takes place. So I'll give you one example. There's one area called the Taoyang New Village in Shanghai. It was first built in 1951, so shortly after the PRC was formed, as a first workers' village. So really workers that had working in the state-owned factories, and then the commune was built. And now has been reformed as a 15-minute life circle. And in there are things like waterfront spaces. All those waterfront spaces are dedicated to the public and cannot be sort of privatized, or made for private use, and also where community gardens are planted. There also we have a planning process itself that's organized through the community structures through what's called roundtable meetings. And it's an interesting thing to see how a workers' village that was planned in the early part of the revolution is now being renewed under what is considered the policy of common prosperity in China. And so to wrap up and to synthesize some of these experiences and why I want to share them with you is that they have some common threads between these experiences, even though they're led through different processes, let's say from mass organizations from the ground below, or sort of a state-led initiatives towards, a socialist project. And I think one of them is that all four are producing space according to the logic of use rather than exchange. And thinking back to Lefebvre, thinking of the production of the space from that perspective. They also move along a spectrum of social organization from the level of the self-governance, especially around the South African experience, to mass movements that are organizing permanent settlements in relation to the urban question, and the commune in the Venezuelan experience that integrates production with governance and also democratic control. And finally, to a socialist project that reaches really the scales of hundreds of millions of people. I didn't say all these things in a sequence, like there's a sort of stagism or something like that, but I think there are dimensions of a similar kind of project, or that is very different than a Western capitalist model of how urban development can take place. And in every case, the decisive question is a question of land. Who owns the land? For what purposes the land is used for, and whose interest is that land producing or not producing for? Questions of food sovereignty as a material foundation. And then also questions of how, let's call it democratic power, is organized in different forms, not just around who gets to participate necessarily in a voting once every 4 years or not, but actually on the ground, how these communities think of it. I think in that, I'm just going to wrap up there. And I have a quote from one of the leaders from El Canal, is communalization is in its essence antagonistic to the capitalist system. The commune comes with control over the means of production and therefore unleashes new social relations. And with that in our mind, to think about how a possible future around urban questions and urban cities that are built for the people. So thank you very much. If anyone wants to stay in touch, here is my contact as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Ting. This is quite interesting the way you're portrayed. It's like a kaleidoscope of rights, bringing in all those issues like livelihood, land, and the way in which people challenge it from what, if I may call, margins in different parts, but also different kinds of movements as they emerge in the case of Abali movements in South Africa, or it's entirely different in Brazil as it looks with favelas. Again, China is different. Venezuela, I think a lot more state seems to come in proactively. So a lot to discuss there. So if I may go first to our next speaker, and
she has to lead.
Okay.
Take questions.
All right. I think we could take questions for your sessions right now, if that is fine, and can take around 3 questions, if that is fine. At one go, is it okay? Right.
So,
thank you, Speaker. I'm Javed, teaching in the University of Kashmir. What you said was very interesting. All the 3 case studies very wonderfully put. But my question or comment would be, because there are all, particularly in Brazil and the other part was of South Africa, they already have government systems. So how is that navigated or negotiated? Though already the formal structures and then the concept of communes. So can you throw some light on that?
my question, and I'm Joseph over here, my question is actually related to what Javed Sab has asked. In terms of, these, what are the future trajectories of these experiments? In terms, one is what Javed Sab is saying is, how do they negotiate with the ruling context? And the second is, what are the further growth trajectories that these these experiments have?
I also have a short question. It's following from the comment that I made. Basically, there are very interesting differences that I sensed. I wish to know whether it's true, because in the case of favelas in Brazil, it's like against exclusion. It looks like that. But in the case of Venezuela, there is like a proactive coming together of state and like the barrios. And in China, it's a little more entrenched, the way that the communes as you present it seems to work. So, I mean, in every place, there is a kind of a distinction in the way rights come on ground. And Abgali movement, again, is very much anti-state, especially even post-apartheid. There is an active voicing against the state. So that's where I want to pitch my question. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for the questions. And I think they actually dialogue quite a bit with one another. Of course, I was ambitious to try to talk about 4 very different experiences, but I was hoping to give more inspiration to think about these sort of from the ground up and also socialist experiences. I think, yes, I think most of the questions were about the Brazil and South African experience, and you're right to say it's very different. I think MST takes on a position, which is that it is a mass movement. It is not formally a part of, it's not a political party, for example. And it has taken a position even around the progressive states led by Lula, first, second, and third mandates, is that there's a kind of support, but with a critical distance as well. So it's not just sort of a broad support, blind support, let's say. For example, MST was very, very active in ensuring, as the base, to ensure that Lula could run again. Remember, there was the case of lawfare that was put against him under what's called the car wash scandal. Basically was the right wing under Bolsonaro preventing him from using lawfare to prevent him from running again. And it was MST who were there organizing the vigil that stayed for over 500 days through the cold, through the heat, encamped in front of where he was being held, and maintained that visible resistance. So there's a huge part of MST supporting the Lula government as a progressive government. At the same time, there's also lots of criticisms around, for example, many of the territories that have been occupied through occupation are still waiting for their land settlements that is constitutionally protected. And that has been a huge source of tension of how little, through the MST's assessment, the Lula government has really done to ensure that this process of agrarian reform for landless peasants continues. That being said, I think many of the struggles that MST has led has actually become part of policy. So this is an interesting example. I gave one where the urban strategy of the last few years with the solidarity kitchens have actually became a national solidarity kitchen plan by the government. And I can point to a few other things that they've done as well. For example, and this was also one through struggle, even with a progressive government, of how to fight for that space. For example, they have a program which is called, I guess, the Acquisition of Food program that ensures that the government has to purchase food directly from agrarian reform settlements. And this is particularly for public schools, for public hospitals, and other food banks. And this was something that was under struggle, but under the Lula government first one, to ensure that there is also a government support of these agrarian reform settlements and to maintain that sort of cycle of food production. And I can name many other things, including specifically around education and ensuring that there's a certain 500,000 basically people have gone through universities who are people coming from who were landless peasants and now into settlements access education for free and gets special scholarships, etc. And all of this is state funded. So MST is behind designing those programs specifically for that grouping. And I could name others that have come up. So that's in a way that relationship. For South Africa, I think some of you in your questions already pointed out the relationship is very different. When I mentioned the 24 members of Abatlali that have been assassinated over the years, a lot of those have been due to political violence and antagonisms with the local ANC-led governments. So that's something that has also informed their more sort of militant position against the government. And of course, I think we're seeing a crisis of the ANC just in the last elections was the first time since 1994 where it's basically its political hegemony was being threatened, and they were in a way forced, or you can say they made a concession to actually create a joint government with the Democratic Alliance, which is a pretty right wing and with a largely white or Afrikaner base. So this has been seen by many people as a kind of sellout of the kind of promise that was the anti-apartheid struggle, and then the larger sort of more revolutionary demands such as the Freedom Charter in the 1950s. And so that forces them into a much more, let's say, antagonistic position. And so in that case, Abatlali has really depended a lot on this international solidarity, and they have, in fact, many concrete, not just sort of verbal solidarity, but exchange of knowledge, exchange of technical capacities, organizing methodologies, education methodologies, for example, with organizations such as the MST in Brazil and others. So in that sense, they rely on a much more international solidarity to build their movement and kind of and defend their settlements. I hope that answers more or less the questions. But I think these are evolving processes. They're definitely experiments, but there's a lot of richness to learn from. And unfortunately, I don't know what it's like in India because I didn't get to study there, but many of these examples don't get studied enough as urban kind of inspirations of a different way of producing the city, really.
Thank you, Ting. So I have to pronounce your name right. Could you pronounce it for me? How do you pronounce
Sure.
it?
I mean, this is already the anglicized version of the name, so however you pronounce it is fine. You can call me Tings.
Yeah,
But
okay.
I'll say my name in Cantonese, it's Dak Ting Guan, but that's harder. So Tings is the
Okay.
more English
All
version.
right. Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
great listening to you. And as is there any other? Shall we go to the next speaker? Okay. So great listening to you and the way you ended. I think there's a lot that we could also think on from the context that we are living here. I think with lots of movements, similar tendencies, expressing in different ways within India. Like Ahmedabad would be different from Bombay. It would be different from the post-flood kind of togetherness that you saw in Kerala emerging. I mean, spontaneously, the state was also active in the process. So many comparative cases that you can dwell on here itself. So much to think from the session. Thank you very much. It was quite rich. Thanks a lot. Uh, and if I may go now to our next speaker, Professor Mahalaya Chatterjee, if you could. Uh, Professor Mahalaya Chatterjee is a professor from Regional and Urban Economic Department in Calcutta University. And she has had extensive experience in the field. Apart from that, she is in the editorial of Urban India, the journal. She's been involved in lots of social activities. One of the highlights of which is her involvement in women's labor dialogues and things like that, labor-related issues and allied aspects, as well as she's quite interested in the realms of environment-related NGOs and civil society movements. So, if I may request Professor to share her thoughts. Thank you.
So firstly, my gratitude to the organizers for finding me out and almost forcing me to come here. I refused. I was asked to come on 24th. I refused because I had another lecture in another place. But they said that we will be running from 23rd to 28th. So please come any day. So that's how I came here. But this is the end of a long day. And from the morning, we are hearing very insightful and interesting lectures, starting from Professor Jha's urban labor to public health, and then this global experience on different type of, what we say, the experiments to survive in the capitalist world. So I think, how much time I will get? 15 to 20? So I was asked to talk about Global South, peace, solidarity, the ways to better living, and so and so. But let me start with a bit back. That what is Global South? What do we mean by Global South? When I started to study economics, say in late 70s or early 80s, the world was divided into first world, second world, and third world, and we were in the third world. Then at the start of the 90s, the so-called second world vanished. The World Bank methodology or World Bank terminology was advanced capitalist countries, then the countries in transition, and then the rest of the world. Then other types of terminology like developed countries, underdeveloped countries, then underdeveloped was being upgraded to developing countries, and so and so. And now this new terminology is Global South. Now, how it makes different from the other underdeveloped or developing countries or something like that. Now, this Global South, what we mean by Global South, it's not basically a geographical identity lying in the South. It's the parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which is generally collectively called the Global South. Now, this basically, this is to say that most of these things, most of these countries, it is about historical experience, political economy, and development trajectories that bring them together. that bring them together. And most of these countries, especially in Asia and Africa, were parts of colonial rule for a long time. Last week, I had to lecture about Thailand-India economic relations. And I was surprised to find that in South and Southeast Asia, Thailand was the only country which was never subjugated. It always had a monarchy. Now it's a so-called constitutional monarchy like UK. Anyway, so there are different types of political trajectories and others, but generally speaking, the colonial countries, the colonial history led to sort of colonial extractions leading to shaping city forms. It was mainly port cities, and then it was not, what should I say, industrialization, but factories to help the colonial rulers. And in some other, and it was mainly agro-processing type of thing, cotton, jute, etc. And in other countries, especially if you talk about the oil-rich countries of Middle East and North Africa, the MENA countries, it's a peculiar type of urbanization, that is the colonialist, different forms of colonial power. They directly did not subjugate, but they controlled the economic sphere before the rise of the OPEC. This was 7 sisters, 7 companies or multinational companies of the world, 4 US, 3 British, and 1 British UK consortium. They controlled the whole world of oil. Then the OPEC came, and OPEC somehow formed another type of cartel and others. But this gave rise to another type of urbanization, which is based on a particular resource, which was not to be found in the history of urbanization of the world. And after this 2001 9/11 type of thing, these countries, they started to invest in their own urban areas, so that what we can see in Dubai and other places today and others. But again, this particular oil is their Achilles' heel, and I'm not going to elaborate, but you can see how they have become vulnerable to imperial power, and what should I say, imperial versus imperial and Zionist along with the fundamentalist fighting, and we are all suffering. And this suffering in different forms of others, this suffering may justify the quote unquote the term global. Starting from the 90s, with the fall of Berlin Wall and Soviet Union and so, we thought we would be part of the global world. At least we are promised that we are global world, that there will be labor and capital will be smoothly moving around the world. And a new term came, that global value chain. Global value chain, we all became parts of global value chain. A particular commodity, once upon a time, we know that international trade is based on comparative advantage. The country exports that product in which it has comparative advantage. But now with global value chain, it's not the product itself, it's a part of the product. If you look at a very small thing, cartridge of a printer, you will see it is manufactured somewhere, it is packaged somewhere, and it is marketed by some other people. So that is what we are taught as global value chain. Global value chain. Now, at the advent of COVID, I have some of my relatives, my brothers and others working in UK and US as doctors. They said they are not getting these protective kits because they would be coming from China. Just think of this, that if those things don't arrive from China, all of them will be exposed to this corona and others. They have to work as front runners, but they don't have their protective kits. And so much so of globalization, as at that time everything was stopped, they were not getting enough kits from China itself. So what I'm trying to say, that yes, globalization has opened many things. We have many something which were not thought of even 50 years ago. I remember when I was a child, when anybody came from so-called developed countries, UK or USA, we used to just look at their goods and dresses and etc. what they have bought. Now, my kids are not that surprised because they are connected with their cousins in the developed countries in different ways. Different ways, even they play chess online. Four brothers play chess together online. Online. That is a good thing. That is a good thing that you don't have to don't have to wait for airmails and others. You can connect instantly. You know instantly what is happening, etc. But what is the problem? Recently, India signed two treaties, one with US, another with European Union. European Union, and just today I was going through an article that how that would affect the Indian agrarian sector. As you know that still now, even after everything, India, 60% of India's people depend on agriculture for their livelihood. Once upon a time, the calculation was easy that 80% of India's population dependent on agriculture and 80% of our GDP came from agriculture. Now things have changed. More than 60% of our GDP is coming from so-called tertiary service sector that is based in the urban, but still 60% of the people are depending on or directly or indirectly engaged with agriculture. Now this is something not very particular to India or special to India. This happens to any other so-called global south countries. Global south countries. Now, what happened in the so-called developed countries? Developed countries, they intensified their agriculture with the better technology, seeds and others, so that only 15% of their population, 15% of their population could be engaged in agriculture. I must not say they feed their whole population from their agriculture, but they have, for other sources of income, they can import food from the so-called other parts of the world. But what is the situation of Indian agriculture? Now, way back in 1967, there is a brilliant article by an economist called Shakuntala Mehra, that surplus labor in Indian agriculture, in which she estimated that about 70% of the labor engaged in agriculture is surplus. If you bring them out from agriculture, no harm will be done to agriculture. Now, much water has flown after that. That is the time when this green revolution thing started, that we went for better technology, irrigation-based agriculture, hybrid seeds, fertilizers, etc. Green revolution came in one part of India, but directly, but it was spread in other parts in some way or other. You cannot say any state which has not experienced the effect of advanced technology in agriculture. But that story remained, that we were taught that agriculture is suffering from surplus labor. And then the whole planning period, starting from 1950 to 1991, the agriculture enjoyed lots of subsidies in terms of say irrigation water, power, seeds, fertilizers, etc. Now agriculture and so-called agricultural income was not taxed. So that gave rise to a new group of agriculturists, apart from the so-called feudal agriculturalists and others having lots and lots of. Just now, we have seen that land reform was given so much emphasis. Now, this land reform did not happen in India except some particular corners. Now, land reform, of course, gave another type of boost in agricultural sector. In West Bengal, we have seen that after the land reform that happened in late 70s and early 80s, agricultural production went up in leaps and bounds. Went up in leaps and bounds during almost the whole of the 90s. West Bengal was the forerunner in the production of paddy. But that has to slow down, and has to slow down because of land. Because of land, when land reform was done in West Bengal, the Operation Barga and other things, when it was done in West Bengal, say one farmer received land. But after 30 years, this land was divided among his three sons. Three sons, so agriculture no more becomes an income generating thing for these three brothers. So at least one has to leave. One has to leave agriculture for some other pursuit. It may be some non-farming activity within the village, or he has to go to the city. He has to go to the city, and not only West Bengal, but you can see in one of the presentation you have seen that India has more than 3,500 census towns. Those census towns is something, and it is almost the same as the number of statutory towns, which is stands around 4,000 according to 2011 census. Now, these census towns are something who, by definition, 75% of the working population should be in non-agricultural pursuit. So that means that in India, we are having something called in situ urbanization, where people are changing occupation and getting involved in something other, so that villages are turning into so-called census towns. But what is happening to the cities? What is happening to the small towns and others? Now, people have shown that India is now having and now facing a different type of migration. As I have said, that at least one person of the family, he stays in the village. The other two goes to the city in pursuit of different jobs. And we have seen, and that is one of the reasons we could see the return migration during the COVID. And if there is nothing in the villages left, then this return migration will not happen. But who are these people? Who are these people? When we are talking about the 60% of our GDP is coming from tertiary sector, we must remember that this tertiary sector is not only the hi-fi IT sector and others, where people sit in air-conditioned rooms and do something. This 60% of the GDP comes mostly from the informal sector. Now, in the morning, Professor Jha said that this formal, informal is rubbish. I am not said this is rubbish, but this is something which is getting blurred, because there is an informal appendage to formal sector everywhere. Everywhere. When we see uniformed security guards, we don't remember that they don't work for the institution which they are guarding. They are coming from some other agency, and in most of the times, they do not have proper so-called appointment letter, the other things like what they would get and what they would get as social security and any other things. So you see the contractual workers and everything, they are increasing in Indian urban sector. Contractual sectors, contractual workers, casual workers, they form India's urban workforce. And there comes the question of solidarity and trade unionism, etc., etc. Now, the trade union, what we traditionally had in the factories and others, that will not do. That type of idea will not do. We have already heard about the gig workers, the IT-based workers, etc., how they are being exploited. They are not called workers, they are called partners, but they do not get the share of the increase in income. Their income is fixed. When you deliver something, your income is fixed. Income is fixed, and you see that sometimes if you order in Zomato or others, they ask you whether you want to give a tip. Now, why this concept of tip and etc. This typically colonial feudal idea that you are happy with his work, so you are giving away something. So we are raising all over India. We are raising. Yesterday when I was coming, my co-passenger, he was asking the driver about the election prospects in Kerala, coming election prospects in Kerala, and then he asked about the job prospects and etc. Then I said, all over India, this is an elusive thing. Nobody is talking of permanent job. Nobody is talking of formal permanent job. Everywhere, in every state, in different forms, the economy is running on contractual casual workers. Now, when you talk of uniting them, in the morning, Sandeep talked about this Paschim Bongo Griho Poricharika Samiti. Griho Poricharika Samiti. Now, I had some round of interacting with them. We have a women labor listening circle. In which we sit with women workers in mostly in not so typical jobs. Not so typical jobs like medical representatives. You don't find much medical representative. Maybe in West Bengal, 15 or 18% of the total medical representatives are female. Then also some others, we have sat with tea garden workers, we have sat with handloom weavers and so, and this Griho Poricharika Samiti is also one of them. And I had the privilege to attend their state level convention last year, but that is a different story. Now, traditional Marxists, they used to say that these, the problems of female workers, etc., are not something to ponder upon on others. When socialism arrives, they will be wiped out. Socialism will take care of typical female problems or others. But I don't know when socialism will arrive. But what we see, these female workers everywhere, they in some sort of typical problems, typical of women, and that is the lack of proper washrooms. The absence of creche, etc. Now, after all, once upon a time, I did some work on the insistence of this our urban development ministry, that about the so little female participation rate in India. Then I tried to look it into as an economist in a supply demand framework. That what are the demand side problems and what are the supply side problems. Now, main demand side problems are many. That is, even now, most of the don't want to employ female. If they want to employ female, that is because of the big wage gap and others. They can pay female much less than the male counterpart, and so that is the only way. Now, in the southern suburb of Kolkata, there is a place called Baruipur. And in this Baruipur, it is famous for growing guavas. Now, in this guava, what should I say, gardens or plantations, whatever it is, there is a typical type of job they do. They just, they made cotton packets and they just hid the guavas in them so that insects and birds cannot harm them. Now, for this particular job, what the women get is 1/3 of what male get. But women are helpless. They have to do because they do not have any other that type of occupation. And so this is one of the problem that women do not find their job. That is also found in a World Bank study, that mismatch between what women want and what is available for them. And it is especially true for smaller towns and etc. That a woman may get educated, may have qualification, but there is no job for him, job for her in that particular town. But what about the supply side things? That is, the joint families are breaking down. social support system, what came from joint families, willingly or unwillingly, is not available. But what is the other support system for the women to work? Where are the creches? Where are the other things? One thing Soviet Union did, that they brought community kitchens. That the community things Kim was also talking about. We should liberate women from their daily chores and others. But that is quite difficult in a situation like in India with our socio-economic system, where we still believe that that women are the people who make homes, whom otherwise it is house, women make it homes, and etc. We use terms like griholakshi and etc., maybe to other them. But the problem is when they come out to work either in the lower level or in the upper level, they face same sort of problem. I myself had to, once upon a time, I used to teach in the commerce department of my university, which had evening classes. Now, in most of the time, I did not find anyone to look after my kids. So I have to take them. I took his drawing book and pencils for the younger one, and the older one was a bit familiar with computers. So I made one seat before the computer, another with drawing book. And then when I finished my class at 8:30 in the evening, I brought them together. And that is because of any institutional support one would had. So when you talk about solidarity and others, now we feel solidarity. We feel that the problems are the same for the unorganized worker, especially for the women. But when we talk about better living and others, we face lots of problems because it is difficult to unorganize this type of workers and then demand something in a wrong way. You see, in Kolkata, we had a long protest by ASHA workers, almost stoppage of their worker for almost 45 days, and then they went in a procession to this health ministry and others. And the way they were, I should say, molested, I should not use that term, but the women were, they were stopped in the railway stations. When they waited for the train to come, they were put somewhere else so that they cannot board the train. And so. So it becomes easier as we are fragmented at the different type of professions. I'm more familiar with women workers, so I'm giving example, but that is the same for the male workers also. When there are different type of professions, we hardly have any dialogue or anything so that we can bring them together. Everybody is concerned with their own problems. It is difficult to go over that and find out a common platform which would think about, as I said, that old type of trade unions will not do. It's not the bell in the factory gate that would bring all the workers together. They are so fragmented now, in different type of contracts, casualty, etc., that the task has become a bit tough for everyone. We can hear, we can understand, but we are yet to find out a way what to do in a global way. And as you know that the so-called export processing zones, etc., they were constructed, or they were built to have the labor, to just press the labor. All other rights are there except the labor rights. So it's a bit difficult, but I'm optimistic in the sense that I understand that when you have come to work, you realize your own problems and you have to find solutions, and then you will realize that you cannot do it alone. So there is need for solidarity, and you can see there with different things in different types of movements. which cannot be described by our classical theories and others, or classical Marxism. Different types of movements that can that are emerging, All the global South had examples of that. Just now, one of my friends from South Africa has sent some clippings from what is happening in South Africa. When these multinationals are trying to force them with more and more stricter there in the diamond mines. So let me stop here. Just to say that global South is a heterogeneous thing. The people living in global South is a heterogeneous one. People working in global South, again, the heterogeneity in variety is so much. So there is no one solution for all these problems. But the only solution is to unite and think of maybe separately for their own solution, so that in the aggregate there may be a upward lift towards better living.
I think, thank you, Professor Mahalaya Chatterjee. I think we can readily, because there is a lot that has come up. It has started with a historical contextualization to the emergent situations of labor, the challenges of heterogeneity, but even when we need to be united, how do we get there with all these heterogeneity and emergent labor context? So much is there in it. We will straight away go into the interactions. We'll take a question here. We'll go for a couple of questions, because please keep in mind that we have running a little late. So afterwards, the buses will be ready. We have a major announcement to make. So we'll go to the questions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Chatterjee. I wanted to ask, drawing from your experience, you said that you interact with women workers who are not in very typical professions, and you also mentioned the ASHA workers strike. Given the kind of context that is used to set the firstly, they are called volunteers. Secondly, they are paid barely 3,500 per month. Coming from this RSS narrative, that it is a woman's job to nurture, and calling her a worker would be an insult to her, femininity. So I just wanted to ask you, could you recommend some ways of how to tackle this feminization of labor that we have seen over such a long period?
Yeah, saying that you see, sometimes we do not recognize this informal appendage. And for both ASHA, Anganwadi workers, all of them are called volunteers. And we expect them to do anything and everything. Anything and everything. If they don't do, it is said this is not a work. This is not a work, this is a service. This is a service they are rendering. And this is not a work, they are not paid workers. I think this is a blatant what should I say? Blatant with workers' right and everything. That you cannot term work, you cannot equate work with service. Service, especially a thankless service. We all know what the Anganwadi workers and ASHA workers do. But you say that this is not work. They are not paid workers. They are not recognized as workers. That is in a recent Supreme Court observation that this domestic workers were not given the right to unionize. That would create problem. Even in Kolkata, this Paschim Bongo Griho Poricharica Samiti, they went to some minister's wife, and she said, why do you want so much? We give so much. During the Durga Pujas, we give clothes to every one of your family. Even them you want. That is, as I said, that this feudal colonial mentality is there. That I will give at my will, but I will not recognize their rights. So females are soft targets. Everywhere the females are soft targets. Females are soft targets, and you see, if you go to any village in any out-migrating district, you will see that feminization of agriculture is almost complete. Almost complete. You will not find a single man walking in the field. They are women. So I went to Purulia, which is one of the backward districts of West Bengal. There I found some little children. They are making something with the palm leaves. Palm leaves, and I asked them, hey, why don't you go to school? Why don't you go to school? What are you doing here? So said the elder one was making those things, and the smaller ones were moving around among the tourists for selling them. Then they said that father is out somewhere, mother is walking in the field. The older one said, I have to look over my siblings, because if I go to school, where will they stay? Where will they stay? So I have left school. And the younger ones cannot go to school because school is far off. School is far off, and you see, I don't know whether you feel it in Kerala or not, but everywhere we can see that the government schools and others, they are closing down. They're closing down, even with midday meal and others, they're closing down. They're closing down. Now, feminization of labor is happening only because this female has no other way. They have to come out because of distress. If you look at the so-called female labor force participation curve, it's basically, I should not say U-shaped, but it's an inverted J-shaped type of thing. Inverted J-shaped type of thing. The lower part, lots of women has to come out to survive, to run their family. Then it goes down for the so-called middle class, middle income, middle education women, and then rises a bit for people like me. People like me, for whom it's not running the family, rather than my identity, my end, that I have studied, so I have to do something to retain my identity. So the so-called crony capitalists, they're taking advantage of this distressed women, and that's why this feminization of every sort of casual or common work is happening in agriculture, in small manufacturing, etc.
Do we have one more question? Yes, please.
I don't have a question. I have a very brief comment. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And about that point which I raised about, and you also had touched upon it in your presentation, about scheme workers like ASHA workers, etc., volunteer workers. So the labor and employment policy which is being made by the government of India, called the Shram Niti 2025, that actually equates work not with rights-based work, but as a service-based and moral duty.
Yes.
So that is not, means what is happening to ASHA workers and other voluntary work, means workers who are defined as volunteer, that is going to happen with the rest also.
Yes.
So that is in the offing. So
yes.
that is also an alarming bell for all others. Thank you.
Force, that is time to come. That is time to come.
Okay, we can take, there are two questions, so we can take it two quick questions if that's okay. Oh, I think we should be very fast. The bus is ready.
So all this talk about women's work just reminded me, I work in the labor colonies, labor settlements of Delhi, and there women who are at home, managing their home, they do work by piece rate, where they'll make 1,000 cotton balls, which are sent to hospitals and get 100 rupees for that, or create bindi packets and get like 9 rupees for a dozen. So they are getting very meager pay, and they are doing, like, they work all day and then get like maybe 100 rupees or something like that. So I think we don't even count that as, work, like it's contributing to the economy. Like we all buy bindis and everything. So that work is like, at the moment, I think it's completely invisible. It's happening in the lanes of slums and everything.
Now you say, I went to a village in Bakura called Kenjakura. Kenjakura is otherwise a famous village from some other things. But we went to see women's work. What they do, they create ornaments from bamboo. They are being trained by that from by an NGO. What they do, they come here at about 12 noon, completing all their household chores. They spend the whole afternoon till 4 making bamboo ornaments. Then they go back to home for another shift of household chores. And the way they are working, they are losing their sort of afternoon nap for making all these things. But even when I asked them that how much do you get, they were mum. They said, we accept what they give us. What they give us, we cannot demand more because then we will lose the job. Lots of people, women are waiting to come here and work in the same way.
So I think with that and with great pleasure, we'd like to thank Professor Mahalya Chatterjee for the very interesting sharing of ideas. But we have one more gesture. So I think you should, yeah. This is tea coming from community effort in Wayanad, and it's also going to the Wayanad landslide victims. So, and it's also a women's collective effort. Thank you.